Many people cherish the chance to love. Yet the fair-haired man held an entirely different view on the matter. For him, excessive attachment to another had become a sin. One day, it shattered his entire life, and to this day he suffered from its aftermath. It frustrated him, for no one could stay by his side long enough to build any sort of romantic relationship. This was his eternal curse. The protagonist felt equally doomed as he ran along the highway, hoping not to be caught by his pursuer, striving to distance himself from his own apartment, whose location had been discovered by the gangster tormenting him. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, the villain immediately pinned him to the floor, intent on committing unspeakable acts that would scar him for life. Hajin tried to defend himself, but unfortunately, the situation was far from favorable for such resistance, leaving him almost no chance. Nevertheless, he was determined to escape by any means necessary, so he reached for the lamp on the nightstand beside him, intending to strike his adversary with it. In the end, a single well-placed blow was enough to knock the enemy unconscious on the bed, blood seeping from his head, leaving room for the possibility of his death. And so now the protagonist ran along the night road, trying not to dwell on what had just transpired. Was it worse for his foe to survive this encounter or to have perished? Fleeing from the incident, Hajin found himself on a high automobile bridge spanning a river. He sought a solution that would help him escape the relentless pursuit, but no way out seemed to present itself, plunging him into deep despair. Suddenly, he realized he could end this nightmare alongside his life. Climbing the tall railing, he clung to a nearby post, preparing to leap into the river, when a motorcycle pulled up behind him. The rider observed the scene for several moments without intervening. Eventually, however, he addressed the would-be sinner, inquiring about the dangerous act he intended, warning it was a poor choice in any situation. Moreover, he even commanded the protagonist to descend, startling him greatly. This sudden appearance nearly caused Hajin to fall by accident. Yet, managing to regain his balance, he tried to discern the identity of his interlocutor, fearing it might be another pursuer. The fair-haired man, however, refused to say anything until the boy stepped down. He usually did not meddle in such affairs, but this time he couldn't stay indifferent, even though he had no family to mourn his loss. Still, the conversation with the stranger distracted Hajin from his grim thoughts. Moreover, the man promised to listen, offering Hajin a chance to share his feelings. Thus, the protagonist decided to heed this strange man's words, for he didn't seem dangerous, nor did he resemble a pursuer. But in his attempt to descend from the high railing, the boy lost his balance, plunging downwards, rapidly approaching the deep river below. At that moment, he regretted ever climbing the bridge, and wishing he hadn't tried to jump. He no longer wanted to die, not like this, not on this day. The fair-haired man, realizing his fears were justified, now had to save the one who had intended to end it all, and so he leapt after him. Unexpectedly, wings appeared on the stranger's back, shocking Hajin, who had never seen such a phenomenon in anyone before. The angel grasped the falling boy by the hand, halting his descent toward death. To lift the protagonist back up, the man pulled him close, allowing Hajin to finally feel some semblance of safety, though his body still trembled. The strange man realized once again how much trouble humans caused him. As soon as they were back on the bridge, Kael released the rescued boy. But instead of gratitude, Hajin grew angry, shoving him by the shoulders, demanding to know what kind of creature he was. Such a reaction astonished the man. He had expected something quite different. However, the protagonist remarked that he hadn't asked to be saved and had chosen to die himself. But the winged man knew the boy was truly afraid of death. Now, in gratitude for the rescue, Kael asked for a single favor, a rather unusual one. He requested a kiss, which greatly surprised the boy. In the end, without waiting for permission, he kissed Hajin himself, not allowing him to refuse. Though the protagonist did not resist, he realized something was deeply wrong with this strange man. He seemed just as dangerous as the one who had been chasing him. Moreover, as soon as this odd encounter ended, the man suggested they do it again, as if such behavior were completely normal, despite the briefness of their acquaintance. But this time, the protagonist wasn't so quick to yield. Expecting what might come, he simply turned his head away, refusing to let the stranger near his face. In the end, to protect himself from the unnervingly persistent stranger, he slapped him across the cheek, leaving a visible mark from his hand. Such defiance was something the arrogant man clearly hadn't anticipated. He even voiced his indignation, despite the fact that Hajin was merely trying to defend his personal boundaries. Suddenly, Kael sees the boy's face, squeezing his cheeks, his demeanor growing increasingly aggressive, and it was unclear what he might do next. For a while, they locked eyes, the protagonist's fear mounting as he hadn't expected such a reaction, especially from someone who had just risked his life to save him. The fair-haired man was equally bewildered, clearly expecting a certain response, one that, much to his disappointment, he hadn't received, even after the unsolicited kiss. It now became clear how bizarre his actions must have appeared, prompting the winged man to release the boy, realizing how much he must have frightened him. Stepping back, he indicated that he wouldn't touch the one he had promised to help and listen to, though in reality, he had only given the boy more reason to jump off the bridge. The protagonist immediately covered his face with his hand and stepped away from the dangerous man, unable to understand his motives. If he wanted to hurt him, why save him at all? Nevertheless, he wasn't intent on escalating the conflict, knowing that, after all, he was still alive thanks to this man. He simply asked him to leave at once. Kael walked over to his motorcycle, but made it clear that by refusing further contact, the boy was losing something significant. Despite everything that had transpired between them, the protagonist couldn't let his savior leave without expressing his gratitude for such a brave act. Now convinced that this wouldn't be their last meeting, the fair-haired man rode off, promising they would see each other again soon, a notion both strange and somewhat illogical. Hajin, confused, watched the departing motorcycle for a long time, still unable to determine whether something good or bad had just happened to him. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the unexpected but fortunate ringing of his phone. It wasn't safe to return home. It was his best friend, Shin Woo, calling. The one person who could help him in this difficult situation, given how close they were and how freely they could discuss such matters. Hajin decided that his only option now was to ask his friend if he could spend the night at his place until things became clearer. His friend welcomed him warmly, making sure to show that it was no inconvenience at all to have him as a guest. Shin Woo's primary concern, however, was the visible marks on Hajin's face from the blows inflicted by his attacker before he managed to escape. Explaining his condition through vague hints of recent unpleasant events, the protagonist asked his friend to let him explain everything later, once he had thought of the right words. Shin Woo, understanding at once, refrained from prying further and simply suggested Hajin relax by taking a warm bath, a gesture surprisingly generous. For added comfort, he even gave him his own clothes, making sure Hajin felt at ease in his home, as if he weren't just a guest. Though it was his first time in his friend's apartment, Hajin felt anxious about arriving so suddenly, especially with bruises on his face and in such a terribly low state. He was deeply ashamed of everything, but nonetheless, he found the apartment quite cozy, even admiring certain pieces of furniture. Shin Woo, returning with the clothes, directed him to the bathroom, explaining how to get there so he wouldn't accidentally lose his way in the unfamiliar place, and advised him not to rush but to take his time and relax. Hajin was immensely grateful to his friend for handling his unannounced visit with such calmness and for being so willing to help. However, Shin Woo insisted he shouldn't dwell on it and simply repay him with a meal in the future, as it would be no trouble and would give them more time to spend together. In the bath, as he submerged his head under the water, Hajin couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The man who had attacked him in his own home, and his desire to leave this world, which had been so overwhelming until the appearance of the mysterious stranger who started that conversation. Reflecting on it all, Hajin involuntarily recalled the kiss, which had occurred without his consent. Strangely, it wasn't the worst event of that night in his mind. Suddenly, he was horrified. He hadn't wanted anything like that, and thinking about the kiss with a stranger in such a way felt odd and even shameful to him. Though Kael had saved him from death, he had no right to act so freely, and Hajin still had many questions about his identity, especially the presence of wings. His behavior was unusual, but that could be attributed to mental issues, unlike the physical peculiarities of the man's body. Moreover, the protagonist noticed a strange symbol on his hand, resembling a tattoo of two wings, one black and one white, which had definitely not been there before. His friend grew concerned, asking if he had fallen asleep in the bath, prompting Hajin to hurry out so he could get some sleep. They rested on the same bed, and the protagonist thanked his friend for offering such a comfortable place and for not asking too many questions about what had happened. That night, Hajin had a strange, inappropriate dream, in which the man who had saved him featured prominently. And upon waking, he was horrified by his thoughts. Hajin felt deep shame. He didn't even know the name of the man who had appeared in such a strange dream, and he never expected something like this would happen to him. After calming himself a little, he noticed a note on the nightstand left by his friend, who was still peacefully asleep in the bed. In the note, Shinwoo mentioned he had to step out briefly for some errands, but he had left breakfast on the table, knowing Hajin would be too embarrassed to rummage through someone else's fridge. Hajin realized how much his friend cared for him and decided he couldn't stay any longer, not wanting to abuse his friend's kindness. Indeed, there was a sandwich waiting in the kitchen, along with a glass of water set out to make Hajin as comfortable as possible. Without touching the food, Hajin placed a note of his own beside it, gathered his clothes, and quietly left, shutting the door behind him, though still unsure where to go. Once again, he found himself running, even though his life was no longer in danger. He was simply overwhelmed with guilt for inconveniencing his best friend the previous night. Eventually, Hajin ended up back at the same bridge, but this time he had no intention of jumping. He merely stood in the same spot, unable to understand why he had contemplated such a drastic act yesterday. Walking up to the railing, he looked down. The height now seemed immense to him. At this moment, he knew he didn't have the courage to climb it again. It was yet another confirmation that his mind had not been clear the night before, and it was astonishing to him that he was still alive, thanks only to the stranger. Unexpectedly, the fair-haired man appeared beside him, as if he had read Hajin's thoughts the boy would never dare voice aloud. The man seemed entirely unsurprised by the encounter, as if he had foreseen it from the start, his expression remaining just as haughty. He tried to talk about what had happened the previous night, knowing full well how the boy who had nearly died here must feel now. Surely the bridge terrified him. Instead of answering the man's questions, Hajin grew curious about his savior's identity. Clearly, this man was different from other people, if only for the wings. The question made the man ponder the consequences of the previous evening, and he began to inspect the exposed parts of Hajin's body. Suddenly, he noticed the tattoo on Hajin's wrist, the one that had only recently appeared, and realized he was now obliged to explain everything. Kael then admitted honestly that he was an angel, but a certain incident had made him different from others of his kind. Now he was considered only half an angel. The protagonist immediately guessed that this meant Kael was a fallen angel, which was, in fact, correct. It was difficult to believe such information, and Hajin remained speechless for a time, unsure how to respond to what he had just learned. Yet Kael didn't seem bothered by this disbelief. His arrogant demeanor persisted as he continued speaking to the boy. All the while, the man was eating a candy, and now he did so even more intently, which caught Hajin's attention, reminding him of the strange dream he'd had the night before. This only boosted Kael's confidence, as he assumed the recent kiss had left a strong impression on Hajin, given how intently the boy was watching him now. Such remarks not only embarrassed Hajin, but also frightened him, as he feared Kael was referring to the dream. After all, who knew what angels were capable of? Perhaps he already knew everything. As soon as Hajin realized what Kael had actually meant, he felt even more uncomfortable, for he had already mentioned the strange vision during their conversation. The angel seemed to think he could pressure the boy once again, pushing him to repeat what had happened the day before, growing more insistent. However, Kael seemed oblivious to Hajin's increasingly negative reaction, even laughing at his own jokes as though everything was perfectly natural. Still, Kael tried to change the subject, claiming that saving Hajin the night before had exhausted him, as though subtly blaming him for it. In truth, Kael wasn't feeling great, but his words were just an excuse, hoping to coax the boy into agreeing to another kiss. Surprisingly, Hajin responded differently than expected. He confessed to the angel, a near stranger, that he had been pursued for a long time and couldn't deal with it on his own. The culprit was a former classmate who had bullied him since high school, tormenting him because Hajin was gay. Hajin had feared attending the same college as this person, so right after graduation he enlisted in the army, hoping time would ease their conflict. However, Hajin hadn't anticipated that the bully would continue to stalk him even at university, even discovering his address despite his attempts to keep it hidden. It had all started when Hajin tried to go to the police, but afterward, his tormentor had attacked him again, this time in his own apartment. Defending himself, Hajin struck the man with a lamp, perhaps even killing him. Kael immediately understood that Hajin had shared all this in the hope that the angel might help him deal with the situation, to punish his tormentor. But even Hajin couldn't explain why an angel would agree to such a thing. Though Kael claimed to act out of kindness, fallen angels weren't bound by such rules. Still, in return for his assistance, Kael asked for one seemingly simple favor. Though his words were chilling, he requested Hajin's soul in exchange. Kael found the boy intriguing, as his angelic abilities had no effect on him, unlike with others. The angel wasn't afraid to intimidate the unfortunate boy, hinting that bad things could happen if he refused, which helped to convince him. Though, in truth, the contract had already been sealed, as confirmed by the tattoo on his wrist. Now they would need to kiss each other regularly, and thanks to the mark, Kael would be able to find Hajin at any moment and save him from danger. The angel understood that, in truth, he wouldn't be able to help this person. After what had happened to him, he had become powerless as an angel and was forced to live among humans. Moreover, in order to continue his existence, he had to take human souls, which made him cruel, though it was a necessity. Thus, their agreement was one-sided. The protagonist would be the one to help the angel, while Kael, despite his promises, wouldn't intervene. The next kiss lasted far longer than the previous one. Kael enjoyed it even more, while the boy was more unsettled by the brazen act. The angel found the protagonist's flustered reaction endearing and didn't hesitate to voice his amusement at the boy's innocence, knowing they would be spending quite a lot of time together. Kael wanted to know the name of the person whose soul would sustain him, but Hajin stubbornly refused to share it. As he walked away, Hajin regretted agreeing to all of this. He could no longer justify his actions by the despair he had felt the night before, standing on the edge of the bridge. Meanwhile, Kael followed close behind, not letting Hajin out of his sight, demanding the boy tell him his name, and at one point even flew on his wings through the center of the city. This surprised Hajin. Other people could see Kael too, which could create problems, but it turned out only Hajin could see him in such moments. The angel was relentless in his pursuit of more information about Hajin, but the boy refused, already regretting the deal he'd made. After all, the mark on his wrist would allow Kael to find him at any time, so it seemed pointless to share more details. Yet Kael insisted that, like any two people who spoke with each other, they should at least exchange names. Hajin pondered for a long time whether it made sense to open up to such a strange man, who unnerved him with his overconfidence. At that moment, Kael realized that Hajin already belonged to him and would do everything he required. He couldn't lose sight of such a special person. Suddenly, the protagonist made up his mind and revealed his name, then quickly walked away, hoping this would finally end Kael's pursuit. But he was wrong. Kael continued to press him on other matters, asking about significant moments in his life, and eventually introduced himself in return, making them a little closer. Now Hajin could learn more about the one helping him, and he wanted to know why an angel would need a human soul. Kael claimed it was a custom among angels to repay for their help in this way, but that wasn't the truth. By that time, they had reached Hajin's apartment. Kael had accompanied him all the way back to the place he had fled the night before. Hajin was afraid to open the door, unsure if he wanted to find a dead body inside or a living enemy who might attack him at any moment. At first, Kael didn't understand why the boy hesitated to enter his own home, standing at the threshold with his hand on the door handle. But then he realized what was troubling him and decided to help, placing his hand over Hajin's to give him the courage to push the door open. The door was unlocked and opened easily, but no one rushed out to attack the boy. However, the mess inside was obvious, confirming Hajin's story. There was a blood stain on the bed from the previous night's incident, but the bed itself was empty. The gangster had left, meaning he was still alive. On the one hand, this was good. Hajin wouldn't be jailed for such a terrible crime, but there was still the risk of a second attack. Kael lay down on the bed, unbothered by the bloodstain, and deliberately reminded Hajin that he was still in danger, making sure the boy wouldn't run away. Hajin could see this was a form of manipulation, but he didn't say anything. After all, Kael was right. He simply glared at the angel. Seizing the opportunity, Kael suggested that living in this apartment would be difficult, as the criminal knew where to find him. But with nowhere else to go, and unable to live with his friend forever, Hajin was left with no choice but to clean up the mess and hope not to encounter his attacker anytime soon. Suddenly, Kael pulled Hajin close by the hand and offered for him to move in with him. After all, they'd be seeing each other often, and it would keep Hajin safe. At first, Hajin was furious at such audacious behavior and the unpleasant offer, so he began hitting Kael with pillows in frustration. Yet eventually, he realized that this was the safest and most practical option. Otherwise, he'd constantly live in fear of being found. Kael's apartment turned out to be quite luxurious, filled with expensive furniture. It was clear that the angel had money, though it wasn't obvious how he earned it. Kael wasn't very cautious with his guest, merely advising him not to worry about staying there temporarily before heading to another room to change his clothes. The life of an angel, as imagined by churchgoers, typically didn't involve such lavish accommodations. Considering he was a fallen angel, Hajin assumed Kael must have acquired his wealth through dishonest means, and his personality only reinforced that suspicion. Suddenly, the apartment's owner emerged from the shower, wearing nothing but a towel, which embarrassed the boy who stood nearby. Though his appearance was indeed inappropriate, Kael brushed it off, attributing Hajin's reaction to his imagination, as if the boy's strange dreams were to blame. Hajin regretted ever letting the angel know about those dreams, and he was even more upset now, not wanting to see such things, even in his sleep. Unfazed, the angel continued pressing his advantage, suggesting they sleep together, and suddenly threw himself on top of Hajin, pinning him down on the couch. Of course, given the man's actions and appearance, Hajin thought he was offering the same thing he had seen in his dream, which made him extremely flustered, and he quickly tried to refuse. In reality, Kael only meant they should sleep in the same bed, but seeing Hajin's reaction, he thought there was no need to stop there. The angel tried to play it off as if his intentions were innocent, explaining that he assumed Hajin might be scared of being in a new place, which is why he didn't want to leave him alone. However, the protagonist could clearly see that the man was just trying to take advantage of the situation, pretending he hadn't implied anything inappropriate. Hajin pulled himself free from the man's grip and headed for the bathroom, stating that he needed to shower before bed, though in reality, it was just an excuse to leave the room. Kael stayed in the living room, reflecting on how he had never brought anyone into his home before, but this boy was clearly going to be special to him. Suddenly, he found himself embarrassed too, realizing what was happening, despite the fact that such emotions had never affected him in the past. In the bathroom, Hajin chastised himself for the thoughts that had slipped into his mind earlier, though it was Kael who had provoked them. Still, he knew he needed to maintain control. As he tried to focus on the shower, he heard the angel's voice calling him to join him for dinner and urging him to hurry up with his bath. It turned out Kael had been quite brazen. He had opened the bathroom door fully, catching a glimpse of Hajin without clothes. Afterward, they sat together for dinner. Though Kael sported a noticeable bruise on his forehead from where Hajin had thrown something at him for peeking, the protagonist sat across from him, still seething with anger. He couldn't believe anyone would open the bathroom door when someone was inside. Nevertheless, the angel continued to argue, blaming Hajin for the incident, saying that he could have locked the door from the inside but chose not to. Hajin attempted to threaten Kael, knowing how important it was for him to receive parts of his soul to maintain his strength. But his efforts were fruitless, and in his frustration, Hajin threw a spoon at Kael, aiming for the bruise he had inflicted earlier to cause more pain. In return, Kael merely commented on how thin Hajin was. After a hearty meal, Kael decided to watch a movie and suggested Hajin join him before they went to sleep. However, the boy was too exhausted from the day's events and simply asked which room he could sleep in, eager to rest as soon as possible. Sensing that his guest might think him too forward, Hajin clarified his behavior by explaining that he was just trying to relax in a place where he might have to stay for some time. Despite his words, Hajin didn't seem calm or relaxed. His anxiety was apparent, which was to be expected in such a situation. Still, the protagonist tried to remain composed, waiting for the homeowner to tell him which room he could go to, and he intended to head there immediately. But the angel brazenly declared that staying in his home required payment. So it was time for another kiss. Hajin immediately thought about paying in money, which, unfortunately, he didn't have. It had been foolish of him to assume everything would be free. However, Kael had something entirely different in mind, calling Hajin closer to carry out his intent. The angel demanded initiative this time, insisting that Hajin kiss him instead, though in the past, this had always happened without Hajin's consent. Unsure, the boy hesitated. Hajin was embarrassed and reluctant to do it, but he understood that he was here for a reason, and enduring this nightmare might be necessary to achieve his goal. The physical contact became much more intimate. Kael insisted that Hajin sit on his lap before proceeding with the act. Now, for the first time, Hajin was actually kissing this stranger by his own will. He could no longer claim he was forced. He didn't know how long such an arrangement would last or how long this particular interaction would go on, so he tried to relax as much as he could. Unexpectedly, he found himself thinking that perhaps he didn't mind it, as Kael's lips were soft and gentle. But Kael's persistence became overwhelming. He pulled Hajin close and pressed his entire body against him, emboldened by a sense of entitlement. Moreover, Kael grabbed Hajin's wrists and pinned them to the couch, laying him down on his back. The situation was rapidly escalating into something far more dangerous than a simple kiss. It lasted so long that Hajin started to feel a sharp lack of air, likely due to his inexperience. He simply couldn't keep up. Suddenly, Kael declared that he wanted to help Hajin deal with the bully who had been tormenting him as soon as possible, manipulating his emotions to get what he wanted. Justifying his actions with supposedly good intentions, the angel suggested they should move to a more intimate level, claiming it would benefit them both. Hajin wasn't sure if he wanted this, but Kael began to apply emotional pressure, trying to force him into agreeing. In the end, Kael decided to take what he wanted without waiting for any response from his partner, moving beyond just kissing Hajin's lips. However, very soon the protagonist openly said he didn't want to continue, which made Kael shift back to coaxing him, hoping things would proceed voluntarily. The angel told him that with more intimate contact, a larger portion of his soul would be transferred, which, according to Kael, would speed up the entire process. In truth, this was a lie. The exchange could only happen through a kiss, so what Kael was doing was purely for his own satisfaction. In this way, the fair-haired man was testing how far he could push his new companion, wondering if he could go beyond what was acceptable without crossing into something criminal. Suddenly, Hajin realized there wasn't much difference between the man who was supposedly trying to help him and the one who had attacked him not long ago. Kael immediately tried to convince him otherwise, claiming there was a significant difference. Although in reality, he was simply manipulating Hajin more skillfully, using him for his own ends. Of course, Hajin's deepest wish was to be rid of the stalker who wouldn't leave him alone, but even this was too much for him. Nonetheless, when he asked if this would truly help and heard Kael's blatant lie, he chose to believe it, agreeing to everything just to make it end as quickly as possible. At that point, Hajin gave his full agreement, though he tried to warn Kael that he had no prior experience. But he wasn't allowed to finish his sentence. From the very first touch, Kael enjoyed the feel of Hajin's body, though he didn't say it aloud. It was obvious enough through his actions. He began to tease the protagonist, but Hajin didn't like it at all. He demanded that Kael stop, and while the angel listened, he merely shifted to something else. Everything was happening too fast. Hajin wasn't prepared for what came next, and so he tried to cover himself with his hands for as long as possible. But when the angel commanded him to stop, Hajin found himself unable to refuse, as the words were more of an order than a request. To Hajin's surprise, Kael seemed to care about his comfort and tried to ensure he wouldn't feel too overwhelmed, paying attention to his inexperience. Even with Kael's attempts at gentleness, it didn't prevent Hajin from feeling pain. The further their intimate contact progressed, the more Hajin tried to push the angel away. This continued until he began to adjust, and only then did he realize that such an experience might not be as revolting as he had initially thought. Perhaps it could even be something pleasant.